So, a month or so ago when I put out the Inescapable video, I told you guys to use that video to establish a benchmark for what it means when I hate a game. And frankly, I think I succeeded. It's pretty hard to argue that my videos where I'm like, hey, I take issue with the storytelling decision, or how we discuss balance in this game and here's why, are on the same level as anything in the Inescapable video. However, when it comes to establishing whether or not someone's media analysis has any weight, it's not enough to know what I hate, or even how strongly I can hate. I think it's pretty important for people to also know what I love, what I admire, what I think makes a good, interesting, and compelling game. If my boos are to mean anything, you must first know what makes me cheer. Anyways, today we're talking about a party game from 2001 that I've been so terminally obsessed with that it probably would have been able to single-handedly get me my ADHD diagnosis 20 years ahead of schedule if a psychiatrist had heard me talking about it. Fuzion Frenzy was a launch title for the original Xbox. In fact, it was the first game mastered for the console at all, and has the rare distinction of being the only game to have been playable across the entire lifespan of the Xbox console family, having been made backwards compatible on every single subsequent console. Of the original 19 launch titles, which, just to remind you, includes Halo Combat Evolved, this is the only one you could have bought on a disc on November 15th, 2001, and still be able to play it by putting that same disc in an Xbox Series X, assuming that you, unlike me, actually took care of your discs. Halo got an Anniversary Edition in 2011, and that one's been made backwards compatible in place of the original, so it's kind of a win on a technicality here, but winning on a technicality is the most satisfying way to win as far as I'm concerned, so I'm counting it. And it's not like it's a forgotten game or something either, like it's not like it's getting there kind of by accident. Trailers for the Series X and S included the upscaled version of Fuzion Frenzy in them, and the game is currently on Game Pass right now. It's not getting here by accident. Microsoft has made the decision to keep bringing this 20-year-old game back again and again. If you've never heard of Fuzion Frenzy before, this probably sounds kind of bizarre to you. Like, what do you mean some random original Xbox launch title that got pretty mid reviews at the time and didn't sell particularly well is somehow still getting this kind of support? Microsoft is not a company known for this sort of thing. If anything, it's the opposite. Microsoft's the kind of company that'll see a game perform really, really well and win a bunch of awards and then shut down the studio anyways, like what happened with Tango Gameworks, developers of Hi-Fi Rush, just this month. I've even made a video about another time they did this in the past with an excellent racing game called Quantum Redshift, the card's in the top right, where the first game performed poorly largely thanks to Microsoft's intervention with some fuck-ass cover art, and the studio behind it, Curly Monsters, ended up shutting down after Microsoft scrapped their deal for a sequel. And yet, when it comes to Fuzion Frenzy, the fans of this game are fans of it. When I made my Survivorship Bias video back in 2022, I used music from the Fuzion Frenzy soundtrack for the background, and there were a ton of comments remarking on how they loved the game and how it had been such a massive nostalgia hit to hear those tracks again. If you ask someone who played this as a kid, they can probably tell you which of the 6 characters was their favorite, the most annoying victory quotes, their favorite minigames, and more. That being said, this video is titled Microsoft Abandoned Fuzion Frenzy and I'm still mad about it. And you might wonder how this constitutes being abandoned. Like, they're still making it backwards compatible, they're still making it available, and they're actually still supporting it. It's getting upscaled. And that is a distinction that is only held by 63 of the 998 games from that console. For a game that could be summed up as just Mario Party meets Jet Set Radio, that's a pretty impressive accomplishment. And yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of all the love for it, the continued popularity, the continued demand, and the continued support for the original title, Microsoft still ultimately abandoned it. Fuzion Frenzy was meant to be the Xbox's answer to Mario Party, a game series that was only 3 years old when the Xbox launched. However, while the Mario Party series has 12 mainline games and 6 spin-offs, Fuzion Frenzy never got the chance to become a proper series. Fuzion Frenzy is an example of why Xbox's mentality towards long-term game planning is so poor, and their current practices show that they haven't learned anything from their 20 years in the industry at this point. So, let's talk about how Microsoft abandoned Fuzion Frenzy, and why I'm still mad about it. Also, before we start, this video was a donathon reward. I actually live streamed the entire process of making this video from start to finish over on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/thevivros, say hi to chat. You can find the VODs over on the VODs channel if you'd like to get a peek behind the curtain to see what goes into making one of these videos. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Starting with Part 1. The Origin Story. Fuzion Frenzy is a 2001 party game developed by Blitz Games and published by Microsoft Game Studios as a launch title for the original Xbox. Blitz was a British developer founded in 1990 as Dizzy Enterprises, renamed Interactive Studios in 94 and then Blitz Games in 99, that mostly made licensed games throughout their history. There was The Fairly Odd Parents Break Into Rules, Lilo and Stitch Trouble in Paradise, Chicken Run, Bratz Rock Angels, iCarly, Biggest Loser, Reservoir Dogs. One of these things is not like the other, the list goes on. However, in 2000, Microsoft invited Blitz to pitch a new game for their new console. Ideally, a party game to fill that gap. Again, Microsoft was basically planning to spend just a ton of money to do a little bit of everything and let the consumer figure out what was a hit. So they wanted to have their own version of Mario Party so they could cover their bases. However, it wasn't supposed to be quite as kid-friendly as Mario Party was. According to Philip and Andrew Oliver, the twins who started Blitz, they were told that their audience was meant to be a bit more grown-up. In the words of Philip Oliver, Microsoft came to the office and they gave us this big presentation saying, here is the ideal person. They go to the Pizza Hut and they drink this and talk like this. And afterwards, they might go back to their flat with a couple of mates and play on a console. They're looking for something social, they're looking for a bit of a laugh, and they're probably drunk. What can you give them? So it was Mario Party, but that kind of target audience. Now, just like what I said about Quantum Redshift in that older video, Microsoft liked to meddle with the games it was publishing a little bit. Because remember, Microsoft Game Studios was the publisher for this. The most obvious example is that the name of the game was actually Blitz Party right up until the very end. Blitz sent them the final master and all the graphics for Blitz Party, which Microsoft then decided to rename Fusion Frenzy after that final version was sent to them. Which, to be honest, Microsoft didn't always get it right when they meddled. Again, see Quantum Redshift, the developers are legitimately still angry about that cover art to this day, but Fusion Frenzy is definitely better than Blitz Party as a name. In that same interview, though, they talk a lot about how Microsoft didn't understand game development. They would constantly needle the Olivers about their budgets, saying that they needed to pay certain team members less, or that a coder should only need 3 days to finish a certain aspect of the game, and Blitz had to fight tooth and nail to get Microsoft off their backs. However, the advantage that Blitz had compared to a lot of other studios in their position was that they were used to this sort of stuff, thanks to, of all things, their experience with licensed games. To quote that interview from before, Philip Oliver also said, "They really didn't get it. Then they just kept coming back to the spreadsheet. We're like, we've got to actually master this thing. We know how to make games. Could you just leave it to us?" We had lots of situations trying to rescue our games from Hollywood people who helped fund publishing. You get halfway through a game's development, and guess what? It looks like rubbish because it's all in pieces. That's because it's in development and things don't work. And they're like, you've had half the time, so I expect half the levels to be looking amazing. That's not how it works. Everything builds up in layers and comes together at the end. And this is one of the unique things about game development compared to other media. Video games kind of build the whole thing from the base and work up in layers, like Oliver said, whereas something like a novel will be written from start to finish, and then the edits will usually also clean it up in that order. If someone says that shooting for a movie is half finished, you would reasonably be able to assume that half the shots for that movie had been filmed. Whereas if someone says that level design is half finished for a video game, that means that most of the levels probably have their geometry and rough details, but they're not finished. Watching a video game be developed is like watching a drag queen put on makeup. It's gonna look insane until the last minute when the final touches are put on and bring the whole thing together. Rarely can you thank a licensed tie-in game for much, but Blitz's previous experience fighting with big Hollywood studios over the game development process and learning the importance of putting their foot down is probably a pretty massive reason why this game managed to make it out the door in such a good state. However, this is all backstory. What about the game itself? I hate this game. I hate it here. I said all these nice things about this game, and this is how it rewards me. Part 2. What is Fusion Frenzy? So hateful.
Moving to power station.
Now, if we're going to talk about this game, it's probably easiest to do so if we start with what makes it different from the party game that you're likely most familiar with. Mario Party. The box art for Fusion Frenzy includes the line non-stop party game action, and it is absolutely not lying about that. Whereas Mario Party has its whole board game thing going on where you roll dice and you move spots and do all this other stuff, Fusion Frenzy cuts right through all of that and just goes from minigame to minigame in rapid succession. As a result, instead of the turns that Mario Party games have, Fusion Frenzy starts by asking players whether they want to do 2, 4, or 6 stages for their tournament. You can have up to 4 people playing at once with empty spots filled by AI, just like in Mario Party. Also, unlike Mario Party, Fusion Frenzy's 6-character roster are all original characters, each with a signature color. Green for Dub, red for Samson, blue for Gina, yellow for Zack, orange for Naomi, and pink for Jet. The Olivers mentioned that the characters took a lot of work to design in order to meet that brief from Microsoft about appealing to a 20-year-old lad who likes hardcore games as well as his friends who only really play casual games. So they ended up on this Jet Set Radio-esque aesthetic. The game's premise, its universe, whatever you want to call it, is paper thin. It's a party game. There's not exactly a rich story mode going on here, but the basic idea is that the 6 characters are competing in the Fusion Frenzy Tournament, a futuristic in-universe competition series set in a pretty dystopian cyberpunk future. Like, this is the Wipeout of Cyberpunk 2077. The tournament takes place across the 6 districts of an unnamed city, with the order being randomized each time. If you play fewer than 6 zones, the ones that appear will also be randomized. For each zone, the players play 3 minigames either individually or as teams, with 12 points being awarded at the end of each game based on performance in the form of colored orbs. First gets 6, second gets 4, third gets 2, and fourth gets nothing. Some minigames can be team games, so the players on the winning team will each get 6 orbs and the losers get nothing at all. And if there's a tie, the combined orbs of those positions will be split between the people who tied. After the third minigame in each zone, players will enter the zone's finale, the Fusion Frenzy, an all-out brawl between the players to figure out who actually wins the zone. Before it starts though, players are given the option to, in the words of the game's faceless announcer, bank your orbs or gamble them in Fusion Frenzy. Players are forced to gamble at least 3 orbs, but can choose to gamble more. And if they have less than 3, they'll get topped up so they have 3 to gamble as well, to make it a bit more fair. If you bank your orbs, they automatically count for 10 points towards your final score, whereas gambling them means that you have to pick them up in the arena to deposit them, which is a bit of a risk-reward thing. The risk is that, while you can only pick up orbs that are the same color as your character off the ground, anything you're holding can be stolen off of you by another player who attacks you, even if it was originally your color. If you had a perfect run in the zone and gambled all 18 orbs, but the other players really have some beef with you, I don't don't know, maybe because you just kicked their asses for 3 straight games, they can still gang up on you to steal all your orbs and make sure you leave empty-handed. However, the reward is that your orbs can be worth way more if you gamble them and win. You can only bank up to 15 orbs, or 150 points, but orbs in the arena are worth more if you deposit multiple at one time. 1 orb is still only worth 10, but 2 together are worth 30, while 3 are worth 50, and 4 are worth 70. If you play it as safe as possible and bank all that you can and score all 3 of your gambled orbs together, you'll end up with 200 points for your work. If you gamble it all, you could turn those orbs into 310 points instead. Once all the colored orbs in a stage have been collected, or at least most of them, colorless orbs will start to spawn in that anybody can collect, just to make sure you don't run out of things to do. There are also stage hazards that players can activate to destroy the orbs that people are holding if they're close to the goals, and bonus power-ups like a shield that make you invulnerable, or a weapon that allows you to one-shot other players, or a speed boost that allows you to run faster. Anyways, after the brawl, the final scores will be tallied up, added to your tournament total, and then you're sent back into the next zone to do it all again. You repeat the process for each zone, with your final Fusion Frenzy scores being added to your total each time. After you've finished all the zones in your tournament, the game will tally up all the final scores and award first, second, third, and fourth. If there's a tie for any position other than first, the game doesn't really care. But if there is a tie for first, the tied players will face off in a special minigame above the city to determine the winner. Each zone has a specific type of minigame as well. In the Coliseum, you'll be playing rolling ball and ice car minigames. Downtown has the fireworks and music minigames. Outlands has demolitions and tail games. Military Zone has pod and tank games. Power Station has the hopper and splat games, and Waterfront has the jet boat and orb games. However, while you'll find different mechanics in different zones, you won't find different mechanics with different characters. All 6 characters play identically, with only cosmetic differences to distinguish them. Fusion Frenzy relies really heavily on the characters' colors to make the game readable at all, which is particularly important when you remember that this was a game that was being launched in 2001, a year where the average TV screen size was 26 inches in the US. Fusion Frenzy's minigames are fast, chaotic, and messy, making it especially important to establish visual clarity. They were, however, extremely simple. Controls for each minigame were typically limited to a single action button and movement, with it often being exclusively one or the other, or like 2 action buttons tops. And the instructions for each game could be explained in no more than 4 sentences during the loading screen. The idea was that, since this game was fully minigame focused without an external component like Mario Party's board game, it needed to be as easy as possible for anyone to pick up a controller and have a fair shot after a practice round or 2. And I'd argue it mostly succeeds at that. Now, this has generally tried to be a pretty neutral description of how the game works so far, but I do want to end this section by saying that this formula is just excellent. The minigames are overall really solid and strike a really good balance between sharing mechanics without feeling too samey. There are a bunch of minigames in the rollerballs, for example, but in sumo, you're using the ball to try and push other players off of an ever-shrinking stage. While in Rollmentum, you're trying to shove each other out of the way to run your ball over a goal, and in Roller Ruckus, you're racing to complete 3 laps first, on a stage that you can be knocked off of, but will respawn on. A full 6-stage tournament means that you can't just rely on being good at one type of minigame, and the finales are a good way of rewarding players for a strong performance in the minigames while still giving everyone a chance to come from behind to snatch the crown. Instead of something like Mario Party, where players are often either know the winner half an hour before the game ends, or are at the mercy of random bonus stars to determine the winner after an hour or more of gameplay, Fusion Frenzy leaves the results in the player's hands at the end of the day. Also, the tone of the game is just really fun. It has the vibes of a chaotic, messy competition show, and the characters are kinda assholes towards each other. They'll taunt each other during the minigames, they'll boast about it when they win, and the announcer will regularly take digs at the losers in given minigames to get under their skin. Compared to its competitors among party games, it's pretty easy to see why this one stood out to so many people, and why it still holds a lot of appeal today. And yet, despite all that, there hasn't been a new Fusion Frenzy game released since the Xbox 360. And the franchise is effectively dead in the water. Why? Well, we've got to go back in time a bit for that. Part 3. How we got here. When the original Xbox launched in 2001, it came with 19 launch titles across a huge range of genres. You had fighting games, racing games, platformers, sports games, shooters, and obviously party games. And there were a lot more coming right after those original 19. This was mostly a consequence of Microsoft not really knowing what its new console was going to be, as well as the changing market of console gaming at the time. The original Xbox came out as a part of the 6th console generation, and prior to that point, it wasn't super uncommon for new companies to enter the market or exit it. It was very possible for a company to try and fail to enter the console market, and it was equally possible for an established company to get demolished by a particularly weak entry. Microsoft's major competitors in that generation were Sony and Nintendo, who had entered the market in the 5th and 3rd generations respectively, depending on who you ask, apparently. I'm asking Wikipedia because that isn't really the point of the video here. The important bit is that the market was changing and Microsoft wasn't really sure what would resonate with gamers and help get them on board with this new console. However, what they did have was basically unlimited money to buy up studios, hire companies to produce stuff for them to publish, and make sure that there was a way for them to compete because of the whole being Microsoft and having billions of dollars thing. So that was their strategy. spend a mountain of money on making sure that their console had a little bit of everything and just let the gamers, derogatory, decide what worked best. If you know anything about the original Xbox, you know that gamers pretty much unanimously decided that Halo Combat Evolved was the thing that worked. So that's what Microsoft ran with. And I mean, it makes sense. Halo is one of the biggest games of the 21st century, and it didn't get there for no reason, even if Bungie was basically burning itself to the ground to try and get out the door on time. One of the consequences of this strategy, though, is that Microsoft still wasn't actually good at understanding how gaming as an industry worked. Their biggest rival, especially in their debut generation, was Sony, because the GameCube was not doing too hot. Sony was another newcomer, relatively speaking, and specifically another newcomer who had a lot of the same issues Microsoft was going to have. They weren't a games company first. They were a bigger conglomerate that decided they wanted to have a games division and produce some hardware. And that meant they approached this industry differently than the only other major competitor to survive to the present day: Nintendo. Nintendo, unlike the other two big companies in this market, is predominantly a games company. Like Microsoft has Xbox, but it also has Bing, LinkedIn, Windows, GitHub, Skype, and probably some stuff that people actually like in there somewhere. Sony, meanwhile, is an absolutely massive conglomerate doing everything from banking and insurance to film and music production to manufacturing cameras, TVs, and radios. Nintendo, by contrast, basically just makes consoles, games, and merchandise around them. And frankly, it punches massively above its weight class here. The fact that it's survived is a testament to how it handles its IP, how it views the industry, and how it can't afford to just throw $70 billion at any game studio it wants to own in order to get some console exclusives. It has to build that shit itself. The reason this matters is that, when we're talking about Microsoft abandoning its properties, it's extremely relevant that Microsoft can afford to do so. Microsoft has the ability to absorb losses, take hits, and make cuts if it feels like something isn't hitting its high standards as quickly as it would like. Nintendo doesn't have that same kind of wiggle room. There's more of a necessity to make things work and keep iterating upon good concepts if they need to be refined. It also doesn't help that Microsoft basically knocked it out of the park with one of its very first titles with Halo, which I think probably set their standards a bit out of whack when it came to how they evaluated the performance of their other games. And so, when the first title in a planned series didn't blow up the industry like Halo did, they were pretty happy to kill it stone dead before the sequel a lot of the time. Fusion Frenzy had a 70% score on Metacritic, some pretty rough reviews, but, pretty okay. But the relatively weak reception is the reason why Microsoft scrapped the original plans for a Blitz-developed sequel. However, the original Mario Party didn't do much better. It only hit 79% on Metacritic and still had a lot of pretty major criticisms. It was tediously slow at a lot of points, and it was mostly only fun with friends. Fusion Frenzy, by contrast, was praised for being quick to get you into the game with simple instructions, although it did still face that same criticism of mostly only being fun with your friends. To be fair, they're party games, you'd expect that. However, where Nintendo succeeded and Microsoft failed was that Nintendo recognized that the first game was not going to be the best. The first attempt at something new will probably have some rough edges, that's just how it goes. The first Mario Party was a learning experience, and the lessons learned from it were applied to Mario Party 2 to make it a better game, and then those lessons were applied further into 3, 4, and so on. It took time, but the Mario Party games continued improving. And the fact that it was a consistent release meant that there was almost always a Mario Party for whatever Nintendo console or even handheld you had at the time. Over time, Mario Party became one of those games that people defaulted to if they wanted to play something with their friends but didn't want to play anything that was going to be too skill dependent. Which, I mean, that's what a party game is supposed to be, and Mario Party shows why it's important to keep iterating on it to get there. The first Mario Party has pacing issues, gameplay issues, some design flaws and minigames that sequels could build off of to make better games. Part of what allows a game to truly become a party game is time, and that goes beyond video games. If you want to play a casual board game with your friends, you pick something people are likely to either already know or be able to pick up quickly, and that everyone can have a roughly even chance of winning. Whether it's Monopoly or Uno, there's a good chance that everyone at the table has either played it before or can pick it up pretty fast, and the longer a game is around for, the better it is at this, because it's more likely to be intergenerational. Mario Party is a series that's been around since 1998. People have been playing that game for nearly 26 years now. There are people well into their 40s who would have played the first games when they were younger and now can play the new ones with their own kids. Developing a good party game franchise is a long-term project, and Nintendo understood that. Microsoft, by contrast, did not. Microsoft expected every game to blow up immediately with its first entry, and if it failed to meet unrealistic expectations, then the series wouldn't proceed. Or if it did, it wouldn't be properly funded, and then the follow-up wouldn't be able to improve on the original, and that would be when it was put down like old Yeller. Microsoft's back catalog is absolutely littered with IPs that just needed more time and resources to cook, but which have been abandoned because Microsoft didn't realize that this stuff is a long-term project, or, if we're being more honest, they don't care. This also isn't just a historic problem. Microsoft pretty transparently hasn't evolved much from the company that the Olivers described working with in that interview, where they didn't know how game design worked, didn't care to learn, and kept trying to crunch budgets. Blitz Games was able to make it through the other end with the first Fusion Frenzy because they learned from their past experiences with licensed games how to put their foot down and explain themselves to executives. But even then, they couldn't convince Microsoft to follow through with the plan for a sequel, which, again, pretty big part of a successful party game franchise is consistent releases. For the first 20 years of the Mario Party franchise, there were only 7 in which a new game wasn't released. Every console got a Mario Party, usually several, and that strategy is part of why Mario Party is the franchise it is today. Every Xbox got a Fusion Frenzy, to be fair, but it was almost always the same one. And the fact that it still goes as strong as it does is a pretty clear testament that they could have done more with it with more time and effort. Instead, they just abandoned it as a franchise. And again, this isn't just a problem for Microsoft at the turn of the century. This is modern Microsoft's problem too. There is no room for a sleeper hit, because if a game doesn't immediately do well, they'll probably just shut down the studio. Like, not even sell it, just shut it down and hoard the IP. Hell, they're not even safe if their game does do well by every objective metric like Hi-Fi Rush did, which was a massive success in spite of Microsoft doing what Microsoft always does by trying to sabotage its own games for some fucking reason. And even then, Microsoft still killed Tango Gameworks for it. Overwatch was still making good money for Microsoft after the ABK acquisition, but that didn't stop them from eviscerating the Overwatch team to make the balance sheets look a little stronger. A decision that will, more than anything else in the history of Overwatch, likely be the thing that leads to the game eventually being shut down for reasons I explained in my Let's Talk About Layoffs video. Microsoft is the multi-billion-dollar equivalent of that fucking meme of the dog holding a frisbee and saying throw. When the person goes to grab the frisbee to throw it, the dog snatches it back and says no take, only throw. Microsoft wants to make money off of video games, but does not want to engage in the long-term process of not only making individual games, but entire franchises. It wants profits without investments. It wants powerhouse franchises without initial entries, and wants success without iteration. Imagine if all media was being produced this way. Like, most popular television shows have a rough first season before they really start to hit their stride. Writers need time to figure out how they're going to write the characters. Actors need time to get into that character and really flesh them out. And if we scrapped them because they weren't perfect out of the gate, we wouldn't have so many great shows. And that's scripted and unscripted stuff. Like, imagine if Microsoft was producing The Walking Dead in 2010, or Survivor in 2000, or RuPaul's Drag Race or Archer in 2009. All shows that didn't really hit their strides until subsequent seasons came out. Even when the first season was really popular, like in the case of Survivor, there were still a lot of kinks that needed to be worked out in subsequent seasons, especially because media franchises will evolve along with their consumers of given time. In addition, if you invest resources in niche properties, sometimes they become a little bit less niche. Drag Race was not initially a mainstream show. It was a small spin-off show, basically. It was a parody of a lot of reality TV at the time on a small network. But because it got the resources it needed, it was given time to grow and develop, it has become one of the biggest shows in its field. Something like Survivor didn't start out as a game with alliances. Castaways developed that themselves over time. Drag Race didn't start out having these big, expensive, extravagant runway packages for queens that became, in a lot of cases, the stars of the show, these elaborate fashion statements. That became a component to the show over time as the expectations of fans and queens alike slowly climbed. And since the show became more mainstream, there was more money in it for people, especially for All-Star seasons. A show like Archer only developed a lot of its more famous running jokes in later seasons, especially because you can't really have a running joke if you don't give it time to run. To bring it back to gaming, to provide another example, in the first Mario Party, bonus stars were mandatory. Over time, though, they became an optional mechanic. You could turn them off. Why? Well, because a lot of people just felt like they were bullshit and ruined the game. They don't like that kind of experience in a competitive environment. That's not the case for everybody. A lot of people really enjoy the randomness and the chaos of it, but offering the option allows people to have more fun with it if that's what they prefer. The first 6 games always awarded the same 3 bonus stars: the minigame star, the coin star, and the event star. But starting in Mario Party 7, there would be 3 stars awarded at random from a pool of 6, with the size of the pool and the types of stars changing in future games to make it more random and unpredictable. If you didn't like bonus stars anyways, you could just usually keep them turned off, but if you did like the randomness, then this just added on to that. As well, thanks to the rapid release of new Mario Party games, if you didn't like a mechanic in one, you could probably just keep playing the previous one and wait for it to be adjusted in a future version. With Fusion Frenzy, there were only 2 iterations, spaced 6 years apart and with totally different developers. There was no way for people to build an attachment to the franchise or for the devs to keep improving and learning and growing. Now, I can already hear some people saying, hey, wait a minute, what do you mean 2 iterations? I thought they just made one game and then abandoned it. I thought that was the point of the video, that they abandoned Fusion Frenzy. And that's the next thing I want to talk about. Part 4. Fusion Frenzy 2.
Fusion Frenzy 2!
Yeah, that's right. There's a Fusion Frenzy 2. Why didn't you mention this before, you might say? And the answer is that it is crucial to leave this until the very end so you can understand why it was such a death blow to this franchise before it could even really get off the ground. In fact, there are a lot of people who probably loved the first game who did not know there was a sequel until right now. Nobody liked this game, and it's hard for me to explain why without falling into the rabbit hole of making an inescapable style video just ripping it to shreds, so I'll give you the short version. It underwent a total stylistic overhaul that took the unique, interesting character designs and morphed them into these generic, conventionally attractive, vapid knockoffs of the originals. The personality was gone, the quirky designs were gone, and the game ended up looking like it prioritized looking clean and sterile and polished over looking fun. The minigames were often worse versions of the originals, if not brand new games that just sucked. And while it kept the same core structure of 3 minigames followed by a finale in each zone, it was now inexplicably set in space, with each zone being a different planet. The minigames were often more complicated, more finicky, and less fun, especially the ones that tried to replicate the classics from the original and mostly just fell flat on their faces with floaty controls, poor visual design, and outright bugginess. While the first game had an announcer, he was a faceless presence that just sort of stepped in to announce upcoming minigames, provide instructions, and add a bit of flavor. The sequel not only gave him a face, but a whole design that only a mother could love, and an incredibly obnoxious, in-your-face personality that felt more like he should be hosting the Spike Game Awards instead of Intergalactic Wipeout. However, with that said, there were 4 major changes from the original that made it worse. The first was how the minigames actually functioned. Orbs have been replaced with just a boring straight-up point system, and now everybody gets points. The bigger change to minigames is that the winner also receives a bonus in the finale now, either a boost to their damage, their defense, or their health. And if you can win all 3 rounds, you get all 3 bonuses. Now remember, in the original game, finales were a bit of an equalizer. If you performed well in the minigames, then you had an advantage, but it was just as possible for someone to come from behind and take the crown from you, especially if you got cocky and started gambling stuff. Fusion Frenzy 2 does away with all of that and just creates a system where instead you're more and more able to snowball. If you start struggling in the minigames, you're going to struggle in the finale. Now you might be thinking, wait, what do you mean damage, defense, and health? The finales are just about collecting points, right? And the answer is that that's our second big change. The finale format for each planet has been changed into just another minigame where you're trying to beat up all the other characters. You lose by losing all your health, so extra damage makes it easier to kill someone. Extra defense means you take less damage, and extra health means you get a second life. I mean, assuming you didn't die to a stage hazard, I think. Then you just get points like it was any other minigame. The third big change is that the number of planets isn't predetermined. Instead, you set the number of planets needed to win the tournament, meaning that you might have a goal of, say, winning 3 tournaments and have to play as many as 9 for someone to actually win it. If you run out of new planets, then you just get to go back to the old ones. Usually the winner of one planet gets to choose the next one, but not always, for reasons that we're going to get into in a sec. The fourth major change, and to be clear, this is easily the dumbest of the entire game, was the introduction of a cards system. You started out with 2, but you could hold as many as 3, with new ones sometimes being distributed as rewards for minigames or through a little intermission game where they just throw a bunch on the floor and you have to scurry around trying to collect them. At the start of each minigame, you get the option to play one of these cards by pressing a face button on your controller. Nobody else knows what you played, or if you played any at all. At the end of the minigame, once the placements have been determined, the cards come into play. There are 5 types of cards players can play. There's a multiplier, which multiplies the points a player receives by 2, 4, or 6. There's an inverse card, which turns multiplier cards into division cards and divides their scores by 2, 4, 6 instead. And steal, which steals the effect of another card. There's also 2 cards that allow you to select the next minigame or the next planet, but the most important ones are the first 3, because what the fuck is that? Let's put this into context, okay? Let me tell you what can happen in this game. You win the minigame, so you score 10 points. However, you played a 6 times multiplier, so you actually get 60 points. Except, wait, the person in third stole your card, so you only actually get 10 points and they get 36. Now they win this minigame that they literally lost. Except wait, there's still more. The person in second played an inverse card, so now the person in third actually had their score divided by 6, meaning they only got 1 point. So they're actually in fourth and you still win. But wait, there's still more. The person in fourth also played an inverse card, which cancels out second place's inverse card, so the person in third actually still does get their 36 points and they still win the minigame. It is a deeply stupid way of assigning points that only an actual idiot would think is remotely fun or enjoyable. This is bonus stars on steroids. It sucks, especially because there's no way to know what anyone else has picked unless you just know they don't have certain cards. So you're stuck just having to try and guess what anyone else might do. There's really no way to be strategic about it other than trying to wait until nobody else has any steal or inverse cards before playing a multiplier. But if you do have one of those cards, you have to just take a shot in the dark when you try and play it. And the impact of this is entirely dependent on your performance in a minigame that you just might not know how you'll perform in. If you have a 6 times multiplier, that could be huge. Or it could really not mean very much because you placed last instead of placing first. This whole mechanic, and Fusion Frenzy 2 as a whole, just sucks, and most people pretend it no longer exists. The original game is on Game Pass and available through the Xbox Marketplace to purchase today digitally, and has been made backwards compatible on the 360, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S. The sequel, by contrast, was never made available on any other consoles, and has effectively been memory holed, leaving the original as functionally the only Fusion Frenzy. Like I said earlier, there was supposed to be a sequel from Blitz Games in 2004, and apparently there was even a GameStop product page created for it, but it was scrapped. Instead, the sequel was developed by Hudson Soft and published by Microsoft Game Studios for a 2007 release on the 360. It flopped hard, which was an entirely predictable outcome given that it was handed off to another developer who seemingly wasn't familiar with the original and didn't dedicate enough time or resources to make a good game. Microsoft seemed to know it sucked too, because they didn't even really bother to advertise it. Hell, the game was originally scheduled for a holiday 2006 launch, but got pushed back to the end of January in 2007. Do you know how bad a game has to be for the publisher to say, hey, let's not let this taint our holiday season, just quietly drop that shit in late January and hope nobody notices? Keep in mind, this is the sequel to one of the original Xbox's launch titles. Like, that's a pretty massive fall from grace. When I say that Microsoft abandoned Fusion Frenzy, I mean that it wholly dumped the franchise just because it couldn't be bothered to put in the time, money, and effort to build it up. And it's not just Fusion Frenzy. If Microsoft has a reputation for anything at this point, it's slashing the Achilles of every studio it comes across and then wondering why they can't dunk. The more a studio or its IP ends up in Microsoft's orbit, the more it tends to suffer for it. Even the franchise that made the Xbox a must-have console suffered from this. Halo went from one of the games to own if you were a console gamer and a major cultural phenomenon in its own right, to something that cost $500 million in development alone only for people to not care. At least not as much as they did about those original Bungie games. Like, it's still a big franchise, don't get me wrong, I'm not completely deluded, but Microsoft had a game that was the gaming equivalent of Madonna in her Like a Virgin era and then insisted on pushing it into its American Life era as fast as humanly possible. Meanwhile, over at Nintendo, you've got games like Splatoon that started small and were able to grow more and more into becoming a big shooter franchise. You've got the Smash Bros games, which started out as a more small-scale gimmick game and evolved into one of the biggest fighting game franchises out there that keeps spawning imitators. Mario Kart just keeps chugging along as another incredibly popular game in a way that other kart games never did because they kept investing in the franchise and improving it. Sometimes they missed the mark, but because they were committed to making these games and continuing the series, they were able to get it to a point where Mario Kart is an established cornerstone of a Nintendo console that tons of people buy just in case they have some friends that want to hang out. When people talk about the Switch 2 that's seemingly not far down the road at this point, they talk about when there's going to be new games in these franchises. A new Mario Party, Mario Kart, Smash Bros, Splatoon, Zelda, Pokemon, whatever else, because Nintendo has put in years, often decades, of work into entrenching these franchises into the culture of their studios and of their consoles. Even for the games where they've dropped the ball in some recent releases like Pokemon, they're still functionally cultural institutions for a huge number of people. How many games exist like that from Microsoft? Now or in the past, frankly. Because they absolutely could have invested into making those kinds of staples for their consoles, but they didn't because they don't actually care. They never really tried to make Fusion Frenzy into a Mario Party competitor the way that they never actually tried to make Quantum Redshift into a Wipeout or F-Zero competitor. They threw some money at some studios to see if they could make a miracle happen, and somehow they got a miracle out of Bungie, so they got to survive for a while. But basically everybody else just produced solid first entries that needed time to grow into successful franchises, and Microsoft didn't want that. It was a miracle or bust approach, and the only real change between now and then is that a miracle is no longer enough. Hi-Fi Rush was a miracle in terms of performance, and they still can Tango Gameworks because it wasn't enough of a miracle for them. And Sony, I mean, when the PlayStation 5 gets some games, we can revisit this topic with them, but they are guilty of a lot of the same stuff that Microsoft is. They just don't tend to throw around as much money for it. Microsoft abandons its games. It did it in the past with Fusion Frenzy, it's doing it in the present with Hi-Fi Rush, and I promise you that it will inevitably do so in the future with more of the games it bought up in this latest acquisition spree, including Overwatch. The reason it frustrates me so much is that people want these games. People are still hyped about Fusion Frenzy, even though it's old enough to rent a fucking car, and its only sequel was garbage that no one liked. It might not have ever been the most popular game in the world, but if it had been allowed to grow and develop, it could have absolutely achieved that goal from 2000 of being a game that somebody could bring their friends over to play while they were hanging out and drinking a couple beers or whatever. By contrast, Nintendo is a pretty good example of how, despite very much so being a flawed company in their own ways, don't get me wrong there, there's real value for everybody. The investors, the developers, the studio, the executives, and the consumers in spending the time and money necessary to build up these IPs into their best possible versions. Microsoft does not know what it's doing, and its increasing monopolization of the games industry, coupled with a lack of willingness to enforce antitrust regulations, is a genuinely scary thing because of how many good games are being put at risk of becoming future victims. Not to mention all the good games that never even got a chance to come into existence because good studios like Tango were demolished by incompetent, uncaring executives. I'm still mad about Fusion Frenzy, not just because I'm inexplicably obsessed with this party game that's almost as old as I am, but because it's indicative of how Microsoft never learned anything when it came to this stuff. It was one thing in 2001 when they were still new to the scene, but at this point it's clear that they know what the end result of their practices are and they just don't care. It is only going to get worse because Microsoft is kind of too big to fail at this point. They have too much money to ever have to put a stop to acting like this, so we're going to see it happen again and again. If global warming doesn't put Microsoft's Redmond HQ underwater by 2050, we will almost certainly be having the same conversation again because this is just what the unregulated games industry is and does. And it is frustrating to know that we don't have the power to change anything because we don't have billions of lobbying dollars necessary to convince people in power that it should not be legal for the wealthy and powerful to destroy entire art forms in their selfish pursuit of even more billions of dollars at the expense of the consumers and creators.
Check it out. Check it again.
And on that lighthearted note, that's where we're gonna end this video for now. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this rant. If you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and all that other good stuff the algorithm likes. If you want to see the behind the scenes on this video, the whole process of it can be found start to finish over on my VODs channel. Link is in the description. This video was a Donathon reward, and if you're watching this on the day it comes out, the Donathon timer is still going on at twitch.tv/theviveros. Something else that's still going on is the bonus members choice poll, which was another Donathon reward for this month. Channel members pay $5 a month to vote on one topic per month, and their pick for May, Drag Queens, VTubers, and Jesters Privilege, should be coming out next week. However, since we hit a goal in the Donathon at $200, they're currently voting for a second one between these 5 topics. First, there's the toxic sword of Damocles in ranked Overwatch, a returning topic from February which would be about why the ever-present threat of toxicity in Overwatch, even if it doesn't manifest in every game, is such a problem. Next is who's writing Overwatch's history, a returning topic from November and March that would be about who gets to write the history textbooks in the Overwatch universe and why it matters when it comes to telling the game's story. Third up is you stagnating in competitive isn't Blizzard's fault. A returning topic from April focused on explaining why it isn't Blizzard's fault that you're not constantly climbing in ranked even if you keep playing. And our final returning topic is Blizzard's Panopticon isn't working. From March and May focused on why the style of moderation used for Overwatch fails to actually moderate player behavior. Lastly, there is one brand new topic, Buried Stars and how character design can tell a story. After so many people responded positively to the mentions of Buried Stars in the Inescapable video, I figured I'd float a topic about the game for future members just in case they wanted to go with it. Anyways, this one would focus on how Buried Stars uses character design not only to tell the stories of those characters, but to increase tension and draw your focus in really clever ways. Voting is open between these 5 topics until midnight Mountain Time on Saturday, May 18th. If no topic has a majority at that point, there'll be a runoff between the top 2 for another 3 days, with the winning topic coming out on May 31st. If you'd like to vote for one of these, you can become a member for $5 a month by clicking the join button below. Lastly, thank you to all my channel members. Minnie Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Yoshi of the Wire, CatLover192, Sourdough, Aluma Riley, Cadence, Windex the Great, V, Deleathers, Gavost, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Jules Coolness, Good Guy Luis, Cactine Kushler, Ikri, Hallucigeno, MV, The Only Enigma, and Hazmat Baddick Games. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.